Okay. Okay. Uh, t- today's, I'm Ed Nersessian, director of the Helix Center. As you know, today's roundtable is on the resurgence of Freud, and you are in one of the most Freudian places in the world sitting here. So we'll see how it goes. Uh, Just to let you know that our next roundtable is on October 4th on memory, on November 8th, I believe, Anne-Marie. It's the roundtable on failure. We are working for the roundtable in this early December, and we are also working towards a two-day, a weekend event in April that will be focusing on artificial intelligence. So today's roundtable, I will go quickly through the participants and then we'll start. And lift your hand raise your hand when I call your name. Stephen Rex Dames is graduate of Columbia University, wrote his thesis on the history of British non-medical psychoanalysis, arguing that out of various labor and gender conflicts surrounding lay analysis in early 20th century Britain, certain defining aspects of the modern psychoanalytic profession were born. This thesis, entitled Lay Labor and Analytic Conflict, the Development and Character of British Non-Medical Psychoanalysis, 1893-1930, received departmental honors and the Albert Marion Ellsberg Modern History Prize from the university. He's also the recipient of the 2024 American Psychoanalytic Association Undergraduate Essay Prize of his paper called Essence Shibboleth, Freud, Fatherhood, and the Fate of Psychoanalysis. He currently works as an editorial intern at N+1 magazine. Ben Kafka is a psychotherapist and psychoanalyst in private practice in Greenwich Village. He serves on the faculties of the Columbia Psychoanalytic Center and the DeWitt Wallace Institute of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell. He is co-founder of the Princeton's new seminar on interdisciplinary psychoanalytic studies. He was originally trained as a historian. He taught at NYU for 20 years before leaving to focus on clinical work. His first work, The Demon of Writing, Powers and Failures of Paperwork, was a historical and psychological investigation into our encounters with bureaucracy when things go wrong. He's currently working on a book for Random House about how people drive each other crazy. Should be interesting reading. Cassie Kaufman is a licensed clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst, founder and director of Green Clinic, a sliding scale psychoanalytically oriented training clinic in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. She supervises, teaches, and introduces psychoanalytic theory and practice to students and early career psychologists, social workers, and counselors. She is also a founding member of the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis, a nonprofit whose mission is to make psychoanalysis more accessible to historically marginalized people. She is a graduate. She received her doctorate at Delphi University, where she researched psychoanalytic theories of visual thought and creativity, She then trained at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia University Medical Center, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University Counseling and Psychological Services. She completed her training at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and Society, where she is now on the faculty. She's also been a fellow of the Melanie Klein Trust and the American Psychoanalytic Association. David Russell is an associate professor of English at UCLA, where he teaches 19th century literature as well as film, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. He's the author of Marion Milner on Creativity in Oxford University Press and Tact, Aesthetic Liberalism and the Essay Form in 19th Century. And Craig Tomlinson is a psychoanalyst in private practice, assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University, where he has taught at the Center for Psychoanalytic Theory and Research for 2 decades and directs the Freud curriculum. He's designed courses and taught courses on Freud and psychoanalysis to graduate and undergraduate students. He's currently president of the Association for Psychoanalytic Medicine and has long served on the board of Sigmund Freud Archives of the Library of Congress. He has written on Freud, the history of psychoanalysis, and the development of psychology in 18th century Germany, and has translated works from German on psychoanalysis, art, and music. So with that, we start, and whoever wants to start. So tell us about Resurgence of Freud.
Well, I'll start.
Yeah.
First, to thank you. I mean, you've been putting these together for years. I've never actually been in person. I've been streaming, I've been watching, and it's in its previous incarnation as well. It's such a contribution to not just our discipline, right, but just knowledge in New York City. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And of course, I'm especially happy to be here talking about this topic, which is one that is dear to me. It's been really sort of extraordinary. I started analytic training in 2010, and just to see what's happened in the last 15 years in New York City and beyond, to see the kind of surge of enthusiasm for psychoanalysis, Freudian and other, has obviously been very, very invigorating. And above all, and I really hope, Stephen, that you're not going to mind that I'm going to sort of call you out in this way, right? But to see like exceptionally bright young people drawn to this kind of fusty discipline that we love. And it's been really, really, I don't know. There, how's that to get us going?
Yeah, well,
Sorry to interrupt you guys, but can you speak up to the audience?
sure.
Oh, okay, this isn't doing it?
We can't turn it up any louder.
I see.
Okay.
Okay, do I need to go again?
The louder, the better.
The louder the better?
Yeah.
Testing.
Okay. Yeah.
Testing. Do I need to enunciate too? Or can I just slur my speech louder? If I could mumble louder, would that be acceptable? Well, if I was gonna like chat GPT the main points, right? It was gratitude, enthusiasm, right? Doing okay so far. So much that has happened in the last 15 years in New York and elsewhere. Am I doing okay? My excitement about it, right? That's enthusiasm again, recapitulated, and apologizing to Stephen for being about to call him out, but then saying, really from my perspective, which, we can talk about this more, that these just extraordinarily bright young people who have found their way into our, I think it's fair to say, somewhat fusty old discipline. And then I gestured to you.
Thank you for calling me bright, and also thank you for inviting me here. I think I'm a case study in this group more than anything else. I obviously have, read and devoted a lot of the last, 3 or 4 years of my time to reading psychoanalysis, theory and history and whatever, more than that. But that's, very limited when compared to everyone else. What I think I am is someone who represents something possibly. Like, I mean, even though I'm someone who likes fustiness, in general, I think there is a sort of weird way where, like, if I was at a party, which I was last night talking about this, people know what I'm talking about. Or like, that's something strange. Like, I mean, if I was at a party in 2009 being like, well, I read Freud and like Freud and think about, whatever. If I'm thinking about Melanie Klein, people are either going to, look at me with derision or are going to be, more, I mean, yeah. They're either going to look at me with derision or they're not going to know what I'm talking about. I don't think that's the case anymore.
Jerry is the associate director. He was stuck in traffic. That's why.
Okay. I mean, we do. Oh, is that better now?
Yeah.
Okay, that wasn't me. And now I sound like God. We do seem to be having a moment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I always wonder if it's just me a little bit, because, like, I mean, as much as there are, like, some New York Times articles, someone who, like, only started reading Freud when those New York Times articles started coming out, like, sort of coincidentally, but it feels a little like, oh, maybe this is just my circle of strange New York lefties who are reading Freud. But I mean, this is something I guess we should think about is, like, who is this the case for, and to what extent is this the case for? Like, is this just a purely cultural phenomenon? Like, I don't know. I'm not a clinician, obviously, so it's like, are there more people going into analysis? Is that being felt on that side? I don't know.
Well, speaking as a clinician who runs a clinic, I have seen many more people reaching out specifically for psychoanalysis. When I started in the work and I told people I was an analyst, they would say, that's still real. That's a thing people still do. And there was usually disbelief that I was met with. And now the response is much more often, oh cool, tell me about it. So I have therapists who are coming to train at Green Clinic, which is the practice that I run, specifically to get more insight into how one does psychoanalysis. And then there are more and more people reaching out saying, I want psychoanalysis. I've tried CBT, I've tried something else, and I want something more depth-oriented. So, it's a small case study as well, but I don't think it's just you and your circle.
How many people does the clinic treat?
Hundreds at this point, right? Or hundreds of people have passed through the clinic.
How did it come up as a topic for this roundtable?
I think primarily because I heard, so I walked through these doors, as I told you downstairs, in 1972. So I have been a psychoanalyst for a long time. And, but I was surprised some time ago, some months ago, when I heard that there was a resurgence of interest in Freud, primarily amongst the younger people. And so I thought, well, if there's a resurgence of Freud's ideas and Freud, we should talk about it and see what's going on and learn about it and understand the phenomenon.
And is it a New York resurgence, or do we see it as having a wider geographical range?
Isn't this just so often the difficulty with, like, thinking about culture in the U.S. is, like, everyone who thinks about culture in the U.S. is in New York, so it's hard to actually, like, broaden that. Like, every time the New York Times publishes an article about, like, are young people enjoying life? Are they, like, getting out and having fun? They always feature, like, young people in New York City, and I was like, well, yeah, I don't know.
I think it's a broader phenomenon because there is a person in, I think, San Francisco, Hannah Zevin, who couldn't participate at this roundtable because she has a meeting going on in New York at the same time. But Hannah, who has a magazine, a journal, is also said that there is a resurgence in. Yes? So, yeah, it seems to be a broader phenomena. Whether it extends beyond the US, I don't know. I don't think in certain countries like France, they have ever focused on there being less interest.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Well, to elaborate on Ed's point, I mean, Hannah Zevon's publication, Parapraxis, has been really popular. I mean, she's putting out issue after issue full of essays from academics and other young scholars about psychoanalytically informed political questions and reading literature through a psychoanalytic lens. And I can't imagine this being possible 10 years ago, 15 years ago, for it to have the success it's having now.
Yeah,
I was just going to, as a footnote, in Los Angeles, when I offer courses on psychoanalysis, you're turning students away, which I think was never the case. You can't fit them all in the room. So I noticed this, and very anecdotally too. I'm just curious about the range of it, but there's something happening.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Hannah Zevon, like last night, I was at the first night of the week-long Parapraxis Film Festival in Brooklyn, which is just all, psychoanalytic films. I mean, and not like David Lynch. Like last night was just all of Freud's home movies that we watched without, none of them was sound, and it's just Hannah reading various Freud letters over these sort of, both boring and kind of horrifying movies in many ways. Like they're both like shots of dogs and shots of, family members who will die in the Holocaust in like 5 years. And the room was packed. Like, it is like, they did turn people away, like at the door, which is, yeah. It's just
Can I just add real quick about what made us think about this, aside from Kim promoting it a lot, by the way. It's true. There's the direct line to it that we're just interested, is it a phenomenon? Let's look into it. But then, of course, if you look at all the other topics we are interested in, then I guess subliminally that we are always holding these in the Psychoanalytic Institute, which is, a little bit of maybe having some effect. But all the other topics we're interested in having to do with AI and sort of the sort of postmodern state has raised this concern about sort of an anti-humanist trend in our culture, and I think that encourages a lot of people to jump back into some form of humanism, which I think Freud might partake in.
No, I noticed on the brochure that we are looking at Freud through rose-colored glasses, or he's looking at us through rose-colored glasses. But I recall when there were articles in the New York Times that pictured him crying many, many years ago at how. So my cynical side that first thought in response to the idea of a resurgence of Freud, well, nowhere to go but up after many decades. I don't think it's really true. I think it's real, what people are noticing. We've certainly noticed it teaching in the last 4 or 5 years in a rather dramatic way. And the enthusiasm from, a lot of it is driven with by enthusiasm from young people, which is especially nice to see, like Stephen, who was one of our most among many brilliant students at Columbia in the past few years, who really have made the experience very exciting, even for people who have been out teaching this stuff for a while. So.
And it seems to be extending into the clinical sphere as well. We're both on faculty at the Columbia at the Psychoanalytic Center, and you saw the email, right? That 100 people have enrolled for all the training programs offered by the Columbia Psychoanalytic Center across all the programs. So the central kind of analytic training program, the transference-focused psychotherapy program. You know better than I do all of them. But 100 new people, I guess mostly physicians, who have signed up. It's an extraordinary number.
They've diversified their, outreach, actually. So there are a lot more programs. But I think it's real. There are even more formal candidates for full psychoanalytic training this year by, almost twofold than last. So I think it's very real. And the classes that we that Stephen took with Adele Tutter and me started 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember, but we had a handful of students, and we're grateful to be able to, have a class. And this year we maxed out, even though they raised the limit to 20 students, and we had a waiting list of 8. And we thought of dividing it into 2 classes, but there's only so much of us to go around.
Yeah. I guess what I would say is that, there is a sense that, psychoanalysis may have never gone away in, the English department. People have always, whatever, you read Lacan, or people think about, whatever, Guattari and whatever. That's always been a type of undergraduate, I think, even in the 2010s, who, read these later people. But I think what's particular, maybe, or one of the many particular things about this moment, is that it's actually people wanting to read both clinical work and wanting to read Freud. And that's, we, I think, should and will think a lot more about, what Freud actually means to people. But, this isn't just, a revival of, theory bros. This is a revival of people who are interested in, specifically, clinical psychoanalysis or psychoanalysis from its origins. I don't know. At least I've found that.
Could you say a bit more? In other words, how much interest is there in Freud's actual ideas? Psychoanalysis has developed and developed for many years, and there have been many other schools and so on. But the specific, how much interest in Freud's?
I think there's an incredible amount of online interest in vulgar Freudianism, certainly. In
Older Freud.
Yeah, and thinking about look at her id acting out. That's not an interest in Freudianism. That's an interest in using these terms in a tweet. But I also think for instance, the first class I took with Dr. Tomlinson was just a Freud seminar. That's all we read was Freud. And that had as much of an enrollment as the post-Freud seminar, which I took. If you read something like Parapraxis, yes, there's a lot of interest in reading Fanon. There's a lot of interest in reading a lot of French psychoanalysts. But there also is there's a lot of stuff about Freud. I really am speaking just completely off the cuff here. But it's just, I do think there is an interest in actually trying to work through some of the, Freud's case studies, or let's actually revisit, whatever, his different models of the mind to think about this moment.
I can back that up. So I taught, for 10 years, I taught a psychoanalysis class at NYU in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, right? So kind of media, cultural studies kind of class. We only read Freud. I read nothing but Freud. I assigned nothing but Freud, I should say. And enrollment was between 50 and 100 students per semester, consistently for 10 years. There's just people were showing up over and over and over again to read Freud, and only Freud.
My sense, also building on your point earlier, Stephen, is that there is a renewed interest in the clinical, but not just theoretically speaking. There are more people interested in going into candidates, into analytic training. There's a whole new institute that's been built that has a lot of popularity, Pulsion. And I think that the current moment is so counter to a 45-minute just focusing on one thing at a time with another person, that there's something very appealing about that now, not just reading the work, but participating in the experience of a psychoanalysis, or at least a deeply engaged therapy. For someone to be present with their own thoughts, to be asked to remove the distractions of a screen or any other outside input and just focus on their mind.
It's like reading poetry or reading novels. It's countercultural now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and I think therapy has become much more mainstream, sort of wellness culture, the idea of having your own therapist. It's not stigmatized, it's sort of a status symbol. And so how do you get more radical than that? Right? How do you move out of the mainstream of just having a therapist? Maybe you have a psychoanalyst.
I'm currently in analysis at Pulsion. And I've I mean, after reading it for so many years, I've only been in analysis for like 5 months now, but it is, there is a real, and it has like changed me and has made me feel better. I think what the one point I would add is that I think what psychoanalysis gives this moment is that in so many ways, both the online world and the political world we're in just like strips people of dignity, I guess. Like everyone feels like you're either part of a group or, and you know, that group could not matter, or just you yourself are replaceable and, you know, whatever. But psychoanalysis, I think, treats, or at least the best versions of it, treat people as like complicated and interesting, and like you are worth the time. Like you aren't just a, you know, a quick fix away. Like you actually are, even though whatever, every single person is that way. I think that's kind of beautiful.
And worth paying attention to.
Yeah.
Right? People, like how much are people paying attention to each other's expressions? I don't know.
It is true, right, that I think something that probably most of the people here in this room or who will be watching this online who have had a relationship, an ongoing relationship to psychoanalysis, like most of us, as grateful as we are for what psychoanalysis has given us, and we are, right, it also sort of is so much part of our lives and has been so much part of our lives, in some cases for a very, very long time, that you know, it's easy to forget about what it was like when it was new to us. And it's also easy to miss just how, I don't know, I mean, rarefied the experience is and possible. I mean, one of the things I kept coming up when I was teaching the class in NYU is, you know, I'd make a kind of casual reference to like the New Yorker cartoons, like the psychoanalytic New Yorker cartoons. And very few, if any, of my students had that frame of reference, right? Like they didn't read the New Yorker, and they certainly didn't know, even if they had happened to see one of those cartoons, that what the cartoon was about, right, was something called psychoanalysis, right? They had no idea what those two people were doing next to, like why the cat was on a couch. They just, you know, cats are on couches, so what's the big deal?
There should be a cartoon about that.
There should be a cartoon about that, exactly.
I don't have data on it, but I have the impression that for a number of years, those cartoons kind of disappeared.
No, I mean, I think that might be part. I mean, I think a lot of things have changed in the culture, right?
Yeah.
And people are getting their sort of squares with clever things in other formats, in other forms, in other media. And you know, and maybe it turns out actually that some of that clearing was actually useful, because then what we're getting again is precisely like the shock and joy and terror, or anxiety anyway, of discovery.
I mean, because it doesn't necessarily, if you just come at it from like a place of first principles, like not knowing the sort of culture around it, it feels incredibly radical.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of young people, myself included, came to it from a position of like, well, this is actually like not institutional. Like this is real, this is anti-institutional, which I think is, I mean, I would argue at least this is the way it was intended to be and was at its birth. And I think there's this sort of sense that like, increasingly, to me at least, like psychoanalysis in the United States in the, you know, later half of the 20th century, I think was quite conservative coded. And I think it's completely reversed, where it's like, I mean, when Tucker Carlson and, I'm forgetting her name, Candace Owens were like, you know, lambasting Freud together on their show, talking about seduction theory, which is its own type of anti-Semitism that they were doing, of course. Like, they also recognize too, though from the other side of the aisle, that psychoanalysis is now coded as something of the left. That it's now like, this is what those crazy lefties are doing, and we're gonna, you know, and you know, whatever.
Right, that it's a liberatory praxis, that it's about sort of disentangling the psychic knots that create a sort of inner oppressive or repressive regime. So there's something political about engaging in a psychoanalysis that's, you know, freeing the self.
Well, there's this idea of a resurgence. What do we think, or could we elaborate more on what the reasons we might imagine Freudianism had waned for all those decades? Could we say something about that? I think there's probably multiple reasons.
The 80s were really hard. I mean, I think that's kind of the answer, right? Or at least one of them. The 80s were really, really hard in all kinds of ways. I'm not the best person to speak on this by any means in this room, but I do think that the rise of more biological psychiatry made a huge difference. The sex panics of the 80s made a huge difference. And all of this became the Freud Wars, which were devastating. I think I was trained in graduate school by a guy named Paul Robinson, who was an intellectual historian who had been a kind of participant in the Freud Wars. Wrote a book called The Freudian Left, and then another book called Freud and His Critics, and which was about, Sulliway, Cruz, Masson, and I can't remember who else. And that there was such a kind of powerful assault from all sides, including sides that might have been sympathetic, like the New York Review of Books was relentless, right? And so both kind of up in the kind of world of the New York intellectuals, but as well as in the world of managed care, we were under such assault. And I'm not sure that anyone could have survived that kind of assault. It's sort of amazing in the end that we did, that we are still here at all, given the kind of 10, 15, 20 years of relentless attacks.
There's also just the straight economic angle, right? Like with the advent of CBT, it's just so much cheaper. And with healthcare just costs soaring at the end of the end of the 20th century, like why would you, spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, getting this care when you can just, go do CBT or also just, take new drugs.
Dollars and time, thousands of hours.
Right, yeah.
In 1961, Shando Rado, who was the first education director here at the New York Psychoanalytic, predicted quite laconically and offhandedly, psychoanalysis as a treatment modality will quietly disappear for lack of money. And during those years that Ben was talking about, I thought about that a lot. It isn't only as a treatment modality that it was disappearing, though, as you were saying, as an intellectual endeavor. One thing to add, and that is, we fell victim also to what Richard Hofstadter famously described as anti-intellectualism as a very powerful current in American life. It didn't disappear in Argentina or France in the same way during the time, but at least not to the extent. But I do remember it in training. I was in training as a psychiatrist in the 1980s and early 1990s, and boy, there were attempts to get rid of the Analytic Institute at Columbia altogether. Powerful attempts, actually. There were times that were different. So one thing I could note positive also, for many years, I used to teach, I suppose this is getting on to another topic, when I opened my classes on Freud, I had a sheet that was of notes that was titled, "Why Freud?" This is for the Analytic Center candidates. And the first thing I said, well, believe it or not, it's a serious question even here. At the Analytic Center, there's a viewpoint that this is all old hat, and we have much better, more modern psychoanalytic stuff. It was actually still is a fairly significant viewpoint. I don't share it, but in any case, I looked at it this year and said, it's not necessary. I'm not going to do that. They're interested. So.
Can I add one more factor that I think to the kind of impasse that we reached? Which is, I think that psychoanalysis was actually served very poorly in the end by the humanities in this country. And that in the kinds of departments that I was at Brown in the mid-90s, and we did not read Freud, right, but we read lots and lots of Lacan. Lacanian film theory, Lacanian literary theory, Lacanian other kinds of theories. Some of that work being brilliant work that has really helped me in all kinds of ways and that I feel very attached to, sentimentally and conceptually. But the kind of buy-in you needed before you could participate in a conversation in those seminar rooms was extraordinary, right? These were not rooms where people felt comfortable speaking. There was always, I mean, well, some people felt very comfortable speaking, of course, right? But like that the kind of, it was sort of arranged or set up in such a way that you needed to be the master of, you needed to be in control of a kind of discourse that, in order to be authorized to really participate. And I think a lot of people eventually just threw up their hands and walked away and went on to do other classes in the humanities. You know, and so that we reached, like, as Lacanianism also became more and more, like it went through its Baroque phase, and then its Rococo phase, you know, and as the kind of curlicues became ever more kind of curly, I think a lot of people just gave up. And that the kind of cooperation, collaboration between the kind of academic humanities and psychoanalysis, clinical psychoanalysis in places like this, really, really broke down. And then finally it began to break down. I mean, it consumed itself also within the university, and then people went on to talk about entirely other things. So it would be like unrecognizable, I imagine, to many people in this room, not the graduate students sitting behind me, but to many others. And so I think we, by which I mean we academics and the humanities certainly, bear a whole lot of responsibility for this, and I include myself in that.
Can I ask a question of the two academics? Is that with the sort of like, you know, sustained assault on academia and the humanities in particular, I mean, that's been going on, I mean, it's both, you know, accelerated in the past year, but it's been going on for whatever, say 10 years, say 20 years, whatever. Do you find that the interest in like becoming a clinician amongst like graduate students or junior academics is because the job market is so bad, partially?
No, ask them.
Because like if you just can't find a job at all, like yeah, I mean not even like a non-tenure, I mean you could just not even find a non-tenured job, then this is at least a thing that exists.
But in New York.
Okay.
And Vermont, right? Like it has to be said. I mean, there's a kind of complicated route in California, but New York is really the place where people. So I did a PhD in history out west. I came out here, began teaching, whatever. Ended up teaching at NYU, and then at a certain point, bless her, thanks in part to Elizabeth Young Brule, I made the decision. I had my own analysis going, and then I trained. And you know, in New York, you can get a license with a background like mine. And I spent 10 years at the Institute. Like there was a lot of work that went into that, but I did not have. I was not a psychiatrist. I was not a clinical psychologist. Like I did not have a proper clinical background. You can't do that anywhere else in the country, really. And so, I think there is something happening where the kind of collapse of the traditional structures of academia are making becoming a clinician a very, very appealing alternative, and it is. And you know, one of the things we're doing in the seminar, this new seminar at Princeton, is talking about that. But I will say that it's a very kind of, it's very restricted in space, or geographically.
And another way of thinking about it also, I think, is what makes the boundary fungible between the psychoanalytic and the humanistic, and particularly literary scholarship, which was a home for psychoanalysis even when things seemed pretty bad for psychoanalysis generally in the culture, not perhaps as practice, which is interesting, but as, you know, Freud's ideas, as you say. Part of it is, I think, this sort of insistence on language. That language actually is more complicated than you'd be led to believe from the discourse that we all live in now, and a kind of insistence on very careful attention to language that I find my own graduate students being really interested in insisting on themselves, and it's a shared insistence in psychoanalysis and in the study of literature that I think that they have a lot to talk to each other about.
Do you find that some of your students are interested in becoming clinicians?
Yes, and that's the new thing, I think, because it's this question about psychoanalysis being a practice and a set of ideas, and that sometimes that dovetails very neatly, and sometimes actually they're different endeavors. And so the interest in the actual practice does seem to be something that is newly defined. And I was thinking about the British context too, which is the other background I come from. There's a great deal of interest in the British tradition of psychoanalysis as being itself very interested in relational situations. So even if it's not a matter of people wanting to go and train, they want to think about the kind of experience that psychoanalysis is, as two people sitting in a room with a frame around it, that you might be able to find things similar to that in other parts of life. Like you were saying about this sense that two people paying attention is shutting out other distractions and phones and the news cycle and the rest of it, that as Winnicott liked to point out, Freud didn't just invent a discourse, he invented a situation which would happen once a week, where the analysts would always be there in a more or less good mood. I mean, he lists all the, that people needed this regular space of relation in their lives. And I think the students are quite sophisticated about that. So even if they don't want to train or they're not studying the practice of psychoanalysis, they are interested in other kinds of relational modes than maybe the ones that are now most familiar in the world around them. Like widening the repertoire a bit. And psychoanalysis is one of the places where that repertoire does get potentially widened. Maybe not the only place, but it's certainly interesting to them.
Well, that's something that I've been curious about, of like which psychoanalytic theorists over the years get drawn into academia. Affect theorists, we became curious about Klein and other, and now I think there's an interest in Laplanche as well with certain theoreticians, and sort of like, how come, and what then gets elaborated in these clinical theories through an academic visiting of the,
Yes. I have one small thought about that as you were speaking, and that's just why, so one of the questions is, why did it become so benighted a field, and why is it resurgent now? Well, one reason that's interesting to me about the resurgence is, and in students who are really interested in the British tradition in particular, they're interested in reality. That is to say, Freud's idea about psychic reality, and how that gets developed in certain things like Winnicott playing a reality instrument. But the idea that we can't now avoid the fact that people live in very different realities to each other. And maybe they live in realities that don't communicate at all. And that you could avoid that fact until relatively recently. So to go back to these people who were very good at thinking about the baseline of contact with quote-unquote real, that you can't take that for granted, that there is, Michael Ballot on the basic fault, or the forensic being a figure, and the consequences of forensic thought, people seem to be very interested in. I mean, you could say this takes us away from Freud a bit, but it's an aspect there in Freud as a practitioner that you're actually adjusting the reality of the person you're working with, or you're creating the conditions in which the relation to reality might get adjusted in a context where there seems to be an impasse between different people who just can't talk to each other. How do you get back to those baselines? And psychoanalysis has a long tradition of thinking about those kind of baselines. And Milner too, I think. She talks about the baseline, even as the visual, the drawn line itself, right? That there's a visual element to all of this that may be pre-linguistic, or if not pre-linguistic, not only linguistic. These things I find students getting extremely interested in.
I mean, one of the very exciting things to me about your new book is is like how much out there is still to discover or rediscover and to bring back, and that the resurgence of Freud doesn't only have to be a resurgence of Freud, that we can have a Milner resurgence too, right? And all of these other people who we've thought about, or few of us know about, many of us don't, and beyond these walls, almost nobody does. And then the enthusiasm when actually finally the stuff is brought back, out of the archives, out of Pep Web or whatever, and out into the world. And the Milner, the reception of your book, and like the just the excitement around that.
Oh, that's nice of you to say. Yeah, I think that's right. And when you when students are going out to find places to go, you find, Andre Green coming up quite a lot, Beyond. I mean, these figures who would have been really, the deep cuts of the real nerds of psychoanalysis. And now it's not so eccentric. I mean, in academia, I'm sure the psychoanalysts have always known a lot about Beyond and Andre Green and people. But within my job, people are getting a kind of familiarity, a fluency with these thinkers again, which is good news.
Mm-hmm. Those I know in grad school, like know Beyond well. Like I mean, like thinking about groups is really like that is in a big way. I mean, for obvious reasons, but also just kind of like there's a lot of talk about Beyond. And like I've read. There's a recent article which just came out in the new issue of N+1, written by Lily Skurlis, who just wrote the April cover for Harper's about the APA. Anyway, she wrote about group relations and
the conferences.
The conferences. She went to the Leicester conference, and like it's a very smart piece. But I mean, she references Beyond several times in the piece, and the people who I've talked to who've read that piece is like, oh yeah, Beyond. Like that's just kind of like on an offhand way. Like, oh yeah, that's a person that one knows.
This is also your upcoming book, sort of looking at mid-century Kleinians and other, and maybe British middle school folks to think about what's going on now in people, the gaslighting theory. And
just waiting to be sort of brought back to life. It really becomes, and it's full, it's full of problems, of course, but it's not only full of problems. And it's so easy to kind of read it as being full of problems and set it down. It's so much harder, but also ultimately, I think, more rewarding to see that along with the problems, there's a lot else going on there, and that really, really speaks to the moment we're in. Mm-hmm. And so the book that I'm working on, which is a bit about that feeling of losing our minds, that comes just sometimes in sort of personal, like close relationships, marriages, parents and children, friendships even, and then, builds and builds and builds up to like what we all experience when we read the news in the morning, a kind of being tossed in or thrown into a kind of paranoid, schizoid state of mind. There's so much still out there, I think, really, that we can rediscover if we can sort of hold on past the really troubling parts, not ignoring them, of course, acknowledging them always, and then just like keep going until you get to these really, really finely described and finally sort of theorized dynamically descriptions of very difficult interpersonal relationships. Some of it is really, really cool.
Made me think of two things. Your comment about the hunger for reality and understanding reality. I've often used as an example, and I think to some success, a famous paper by Jack Harlow from the 1950s about the notion of a metaphor of the two projectors, and with the notion that we should reconceive of reality not as what we typically think of as what's out there in the window of our five senses, but as a screen in the middle of a room. For some reason, I always imagined this very room, actually, maybe thinking of him, with a projector at either end, one from outside and one from inside. And when that's such a useful metaphor, and you see sort of a light go off in people struggling with trying to understand the different realities other people seem to be living in, particularly in these times. And then it's a real delight to show them that it's kind of there, right there in the interpretation of dreams, chapter 7, in many ways also already. And that is really, really something. The other thought I had, what you were talking about, in that the current interest out there in group processes and other things, it has, I think, come into the classroom in the responses that we've had to teaching Freud's paper on crowd psychology in the last 5 years in particular. That work has assumed a moving, meaningful status that it never did in the classroom between COVID, the trying to understand the craziness of the mass phenomena we're witnessing, from social media to paranoid theory to all the things that are laid out in that text, hypnotic relationship with leaders, group ties by identification, and I really have a sense of palpable relief that students get reading that work in these times. And it's very nice to see. I remember one student a couple of years ago who came to me with a question about Freud's comment about the narcissism of minor differences. And then before I really even answered, she got this look on her face, said, "Oh, I get it. It's everywhere." She was looking around. And I said, "Yep, just come to a meeting of psychoanalysts sometime."
Speaking of psychoanalysis, I have a question for practitioners of psychoanalysis, which I'm not. I mean, one of the appeals, I would imagine, must be psychoanalytic practice as a site of free speech. I mean, it's got to be one of the places where free speech, if free association is really happening, is still happening, or at least happening in a way that really feels possible. And is that a subject of discussion? Urgent?
Free speech does. In clinical settings, I feel like I thought about it, but we see the same obstructions we always have, but they're interesting. But I mean,
yeah, like in the session, the free speech keeps breaking down, very importantly. But it is also the place where we can speak freely about that.
Yeah.
And that's, in my sense, like in the clinically, that's the free speech, which is that we can freely speak about what makes actually speaking freely so hard for our patients and for us as well.
And then there's parapraxis, which is sort of unleashed speech.
Yeah.
Right?
The things that surge forward, absolutely.
But it seems to me there are practical aspects of psychoanalysis, so that by that I mean you go see your analyst, you are free to say whatever you want. If you hit a wall or what we used to call resistance, you meet resistance, hopefully your analyst helps you overcome it and you go deeper and so on. So that's what transpires in an analytic hour. Then there is the whole of Freud's theory about how development happens, how the mind develops, how conflicts develop, how relationships develop, things like Oedipal issues and pre-Oedipal issues and the particular relevance of adolescence and the matter of sexual differences and so on. The interest that you notice amongst the people you deal with in psychoanalysis, does Freud's theories also seem to be of more interest? Or it's more the practical aspects of the therapy and the analysis that is of more interest?
It's a good question. I mean, with my students, I find certain of Freud's ideas that really take off for them are some of the later idea. I mean, dreams, yes, but mourning, melancholia, and even some of the late stuff about analysis terminal, the sort of tragic side of things. And I don't find, when I was in graduate school, we read 3 essays in the theory of sexuality, but I don't find that's where the center of, I mean, this is extremely anecdotal, but I don't find that is where the center of interest is for them. It's more in these sort of fundamental questions of identity and disavowal and denial, and I mean, but it really does speak to them as you say, one of these explanatory, or if not explanatory, then at least descriptive tools.
That's interesting that you say that. Earlier you brought up the sort of sex panic of the 80s as a reason why psychoanalysis, went into decline. I might argue that one of the reasons for psychoanalysis's revival is sort of the modern sex panic which we're in now, which is all about childhood, like children and sexuality. Like it's a sort of both, for good reasons and also for not good reasons. It kind of seems like everyone is obsessed with children and sex. Either children are being abducted, or there are powerful cabals of people who are taking children, which is both true and untrue, as we know. And to me, that's psychoanalysis has a language for it, and actually has an arsenal to think about why are people so obsessed with the idea of children having sex? Why is this something that our whole society seems to be devoted to? Left and right, this is a panic. And I don't know, to me, at least personally, the 3 essays was the text, one of the texts that really spoke to me reading Freud. I don't know, it's just something that I was thinking about. And I mean, your point about free speech, I might, as a complete non-clinician, respond to that as we're moving into increasingly, post-free speech era here in the US. And I wonder if, there will be, or there already is, I don't know, a revival in, thinking about psychoanalysis in places that are not just liberal democracies. Freud talked about Freud thought about, I think, is this only possible within a liberal bourgeois democracy with ideas of individualism? I don't know, I haven't read many, I've only read scant papers on psychoanalysis, in post-Nazi Germany or post-Stalinist Russia, or in, post-junta Argentina. I don't know. I feel there should be a revival and interest in thinking about that.
We'll soon have the Trump Institute for Psychoanalysis as a new name.
It'll be the best ever.
Yeah.
A lot of old hippies, including some of the people on staff at NIPSI that I know, complain, they lament that people don't talk about sex anymore. I'm talking about adults now, too, and that the culture's moved away from that. And I think it has been demonstrated, I know this is off the cuff, that younger people are not having as much sex as the wild group parties that I used to always go to. So I wonder if people have thoughts about that as another influence on Freud's interest in Freud.
Well, I think the anxiety is about consent of how to be, and Avi Sakatopoulou used the 3 essays to explore that of how can someone possibly know what they're agreeing to when you have an unconscious. I mean, to very AI ChatGPT summarize what her argument is, but I do think that there's been so much reactive anxiety about what it means to be a sexual being when there's so much punishment for making mistakes, and of course some of those mistakes are devastating and traumatic for people, but what about the whole range in between? So sort of young people becoming sexual in the last sexual beings, sexual adults in the last 20 years, how much are they influenced by super egoic, you have to constrict yourself, and is there something useful in Freud's polymorphous perversity for them, just understanding what their own desires might be and how to even have a language for it.
I don't know, it seems like a society-wide mania, as I said, about children and sex. There's all these articles written about children not having enough sex. What are they doing? They're not going out and partying. And there's also all of these, people who go around trying to ban books with any little bit of skin in them, or any little bit of sex, any type of discussion of sex. I think there just seems to be people are obsessed with either the fact that children are not having enough sex or that they are. That's like, there seems to be no way out there. And I think that's, to me, that points to like, there's something going on in this society that I think psychoanalysis can be very useful in diagnosing.
Freud would be happy. At your comments, I had a student not long ago start out saying, well, maybe all these issues about sexuality, I think we were talking about the studies in hysteria, it wouldn't be such an issue now because we're in a much more sex-positive culture. And I said, well, not so fast. Those problems aren't solved so easily, according to what Freud discovered. And there are infinite defenses and hypocrisies and splitting and ways to pretend we have dealt with them. Some of which you mentioned now.
I also will say that with young patients, I have a lot of like late teenagers into college. Like I have a lot of young adults in my practice. And when they finally do realize that it's something that we can talk about, the level of relief, I mean, of course, they're anxious about it, sure, but there's nowhere else for them to go. I mean, there's absolutely nowhere else for a young adult to go to have a kind of direct, honest, non-punitive, non-shaming conversation about
non-performative.
or non-performative, right? Where they're not being kind of enlisted or enrolled in some agenda that I have for them, or where I'm not allowing myself to be enlisted or enrolled in their agenda, and then we can just talk about it. And like Reddit isn't that, I mean, it's not like when I was young, like we had a lot of places to go either, although we had, I think, each other in different ways probably than some people do now. But of all the kind of radical things that psychoanalysis still is, it is a kind of radically, there's something about that people can still talk about sex, that especially young people can still talk about sex, and not just young people. This feels very, very important to me. I imagine in your practice too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I both agree and it's not like we're living in the most repressive society around sex ever. I mean, like, certainly, like, late 19th century Vienna was more repressive. It's more like, it's like the type of repression that happens now around sex, which is different. Like, because when you were saying, like, well, there's no place to talk about sex, I was like, was that not true in the 90s? Like, is it actually, like, that much different now talking to your friends about sex than it was in 1995? Like, as someone who was not living in 1995, I don't really know, but it just feels, I don't know, it feels strange. Like, how much of an effect is the internet having? Like, I have an answer.
Yeah. So when I was growing up in Southern California in the 80s and 90s, if you wanted to see a picture of a naked person, right, it was a very hard thing to come by. Right? Fundamentally, around images of other people's naked bodies, there was a conditions of scarcity, right? And now we live in a condition of abundance. It's very hard to get through a day without seeing an image of somebody else's naked or almost naked body. And I cannot tell you, it was just a very different being a teenager in 1990. Right, than it is being a teenager now, for that kind of basic sort of materialist reason. And I'm not moralizing. I'm genuinely not moralizing. But I think we can't just say that there's no difference. There's a tremendous difference. And the next part being, and I don't know, I'll just say it, which is that the kind of body that has been, the kind of pornographic body that has been sort of spread everywhere, right, is like a body that comes from the San Fernando Valley, comes from North Hollywood. It's a kind of internationalization of a Los Angeles aesthetic, a Los Angeles idea of what sex is supposed to be and look like. And Los Angeles is not the place to turn to if you want to have sex. Yes, 100% from personal experience. Like I said, I grew up in San Diego, and I'm the child of two Angelinos, so I would say that things are in fact radically different, and that and that there are, I'm not saying, of course, no one talks about sex or no one has anywhere to go talk about sex, but, you know, based on my own. And I think the other thing is that people are much more anxious. Like there has been, and I think probably ultimately for the good, a kind of censoriousness that is set in. But the sort of activation of the superego, which is always an issue around sex, is, I mean, people are living in terror. And I think that that's also really important.
All of the changes have not solved the problems of shame and guilt and things, and the emotional, affective
Or
associations with sex
Or
that,
sexual violence,
that
yeah.
just get, if anything, driven deeper.
Right, yeah,
Right.
absolutely right.
Well, I think we're at this point now where we should open the floor to the audience if they have any questions. And if you do, please come up to the microphone.
Is that too much?
Hi, everyone. This has been a really interesting panel. I was on the part of the conversation when we were deciding for the Helix Center to do this, and the general sense was that there seemed to be more interest in Freud among young people, and I think that's how we framed it. There seemed to be, and on the program I noticed today that it says there appears to be, a couple times, appears to be a renewed interest in Freud. What fascinated me about that question was that when I was in graduate school and reading, I did a degree in comparative literature, and I noticed that Freud was everywhere. I'd never really felt like it had fallen away in any sense in the sort of intellectual spheres. I remember reading an article in the journal Critical Inquiry where they did a citational study of all of the theorists that had been referenced the most often in the journal in 2006. And in between 1980 and 2006, Freud was the #1 cited person. But I've also seen data that says that in the psychological journals, in biopsychological frameworks, that he's cited much more, or much less frequently, that it's way down. So my question, and it seems like most of the sense that we've had here today that there seems to be a resurgence feels a little bit anecdotal. Like I've noticed we had a lot of sort of sense of this, but I'm wondering if there are any metrics or sort of concrete information you could point to that would suggest that it's on the rise in that sort of therapeutic or sort of more clinical practice.
I mean, I think we can definitely point to enrollments at psychoanalytic
that's what I was-
institutes. I don't have the numbers offhand, but, you know, in the now 15 years that I've been in the profession, the numbers of people applying to the institutes has, and again, I can't give you the actual numbers, I don't have them, and probably a lot of institutes would be loath to share them, but it's.
But all those people, a lot of people are applying, but, you know, institutes now offer a kind of a range of programs. So when I was a student at New York Psychoanalytic, there was only one thing you could do, is become a psychoanalyst. And so now there is a range, and I'm not so sure what percentage of that range is people who actually want to go through a full psychoanalytic training to become psychoanalysts.
I think that's probably true, right? But none of them are coming to learn CBT.
No, but they're coming to learn psychoanalytic psychotherapy or learn more about psychoanalysis. But to become a psychoanalyst with the requirements and what the psychoanalysis is about, 4 times a week sessions on the couch, etc. I don't know how much interest has increased in that. Do you?
This is also anecdotal, but just attending different conferences over the last 15 years, how much more colorful they've become, both in terms of people's hair and their skin color and so on. You know, that there's just, when I used to go to the American Psychological Association's division of psychoanalysis conferences 15 years ago, I was the youngest person there always. It was like maybe me and 5 other young people, and now I'm the oldest person there, it feels like. So.
We'd spoken earlier about the sort of economics of who goes into well, first of all, can patients afford psychoanalysis, which is an important limiting factor. And I think you mentioned that in terms of its sliding away when CBT was being offered. Insurance was happier to pay for CBT. They thought it was time limited and such. But the other thing is now with telecounseling going on, there's a large need for more therapists. And I'm interested in the fact that at the other end of the spectrum, there are all these people, some of them coming out of the humanities, but not exclusively, who are being recruited quickly because we need to take care of people on a telecounseling basis. I mean, to scale up. And I think the people who select themselves to do that tend to be more interested in analytic thoughts. I mean, I think before they get started, they think, well, what's it like to be a therapist? And I think still the model for what's it like to be a therapist is sort of loosely Freudian. So whereas at one end, the sort of orthodox end of 4 times a week, rigorous psychoanalytic training, that's definitely waned. And a lot of people are trying to apply that as a model to other less extensive forms of therapy.
And it makes me think that perhaps for a future roundtable, there could be something on the proletarianization of the mental health professions, right? Like more and more therapists, whatever their backgrounds, are essentially are now working in these factories where they're forced to see huge numbers of patients in quick succession, record keeping, dealing with the insurance companies. That I think that's really, even more than AI and all of this, I think that's what's going to change the mental health landscape in this country, is a kind of proletarianized therapist.
Same thing in academia.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, like, you have 60 patients, same, and 400 students. So.
Yeah.
Somewhat related to this, yesterday I asked ChatGPT, is there resurgence in Freud going on today? And they said only selectively. It's more.
First it said, excellent question.
It said selectively. It's more cultural than actual people going into therapy. And most interestingly, they specifically mentioned this roundtable at the Helix Center going on as an example of it being more relevant today.
First, I want to thank the panel for a very generative set of commentaries. The list of my associations and memories is far greater than the time I should take, and I won't. The first thing I noticed about the youth is my grandson in his early 20s, trying a number of fields, read a Freud biography. In May, he was awarded a PhD in clinical psychology. He's interested in this and interested in it in a very specific clinical and research way. In his now postdoctoral fellowship, well, his dissertation was with a multi-sided numerical kind of thing, and he's also interested in listening very closely to individual patients, and he wants that kind of dual focus going forward. The next thing came much later, and that's the mention of 3 essays. When I was 17 years old and in college, I read 3 essays as an undergraduate. My first exposure to Freud, I became a Freudian. From that one essay, I said, wow, this guy knows my mother. I'll stop there since I've gotten a laugh, but thank you very much.
Thank you. This is a fantastic conversation. I have 2 questions. We talked a lot about what we can maybe describe as a rift in theory and praxis. We have clinicians, we have people from the humanities, academics, versus people who work in a analytic setting. And I was wondering, I mean, this is a long discussion, these 2 sides of psychoanalysis, and I wonder how much this sort of discontent or like irreducible tension between these 2 aspects go back way down to the 0 level of psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud, writes, comes from neurological studies on eels all the way to treatises on art history. Like it is a discipline that doesn't fit easily between, let's say, STEM positivist psychology or the humanities. So how much is that what we maybe diagnose as a problem in the 80s, a division between that runs to psychoanalysis at the very core of the discipline itself? So that's a sort of methodological question. And the other one would be, if we talk about the question of theory and praxis, there's another field where that is a long-standing issue, namely politics. So I was wondering if the question is the relevance of Freud, we could say, there has been a relevance in the field of politics for a while. Like if you think about, a theory of irrational choices, like why do people choose something against their own interest, or voluntary servitude, that goes back, me coming from Germany, a post-Nazi world where, the critical theory, the Frankfurt School, was precisely interested in that question. Why do people not choose their emancipation, but actually against it? And that goes all the way to, let's say, more contemporary public intellectuals like Slavoj Žižek, like the Slovenian school I've been studying with. So the other question would be, okay, what about this third realm of politics, and what about public intellectuals? Like, does psychoanalysis play a role in that sphere as well? N+1, I guess, is a public discourse space, or Freud himself was a public intellectual. Like, he was intervening in a social discourse. Like, what role do you see here? So theory and praxis on one hand, and public intervention on the other. Thank you.
I don't know if anyone's ever answered the question, is psychoanalysis an art or a science, but we keep taking it up, right? Yeah.
Freud was certainly interested in extending and broadening and including intellectual pursuits and clinical psychoanalysis. I've long tried to teach some aspects of the what was called the Culture and Personality School of psychoanalysts who were very influenced by Freud. I don't know. I don't think in terms of public intellectuals, that's a problem in general we lack a lot of in this society, although we're hearing that the Helix Center may actually bump it up a bit. So.
But I'd be interested, David, in what you think in the U.S. and, in a small way, right? But, the Adam Phillipses and Jacqueline Roses and whatnot, who are sort of important, analytically trained figures who have an audience and all of that. It's sort of hard to find counterparts here.
Well,
Jameson Webster, maybe, yeah. What do you think the difference is?
So one immediate response I thought about why the cultural interest in psychoanalysis might be germane now is that psychoanalysis doesn't, as a set of ideas or a discourse, doesn't have to be reducible to politics or morality. And that could be pretty useful as a space of thinking. I mean, it's connected to politics and morality, but it's not explainable or reducible entirely to them. That's interesting. The specific question you asked, though, Ben, yeah, Adam said to me that, Adam Phillips said to me that if he was to start out now, he's not sure that it would work in the same way for him, right? Like, and Jacqueline Rose they're about the same. Well, they're the same age. So I'm trying to think. Adam came out of a culture that it was the end of the welfare state psychoanalysis. So there was a moment in Britain when it had permeated the culture because it was just there. What's very interesting about the British case is that psychoanalysis was part of the growth of a state institutional response to public health after World War II. And Adam's own career is interesting because he caught the very end of that. He started in working in hospitals, And then people started saying to him, you've got a new patient, you can have 10 sessions, that's it. And he'd say, well, what if they need 55 or 3? And they said, no, it's got to be 10, you've got to do all 10. And he said, well, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't work, right? So it moved from, the NHS is still so much at the center of British culture in so many ways. It's one of the largest employers. Even people on the left and the right will say they want to save the NHS. Psychoanalysis was in the middle of that, but hasn't been so for a long time. And then the other part, I think, that's the British approach to psychoanalysis is that it's historically very connected to literature and art. And so it was never fully, and you're the expert on this, you've written about this, but it was never fully medicalized. And that meant that it was always in conversation with culture. And I think that was ready to be reactivated by people I know in Britain who are really interested in it now. And one project I think would be something that's interesting for someone to do, I don't know, maybe not, is to revive the history of the Imago group in Britain in the mid-20th century, where you had Marion Milner going, and you had major psychoanalytic figures, and you also had Ernst Gombrich and Adrian Stokes and people. There was this sense that there was this sort of total cultural conversation going on, and maybe it's because Britain's also a smaller country, so you can do it. You can throw your arms around it. But yeah, my guess, and I've just had this thought while I was elaborating it, so I'm not sure how firm it is that the cultural confluence that, to take Adam Phillips' career as an example, I mean, he was trained by Leavisite literary teachers when he was young. Always literature's been as important to him as psychoanalysis. That conjunction was there ready to be re-energized when people got interested in it again.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to emphasize the fact that Britain, from a very young, from the earliest days of English British psychoanalysis, it was a lay culture. Yeah. I mean, they had, of course, many prominent medical psychoanalysts, but I mean, some of the most famous, of course, of British psychoanalysts are lay, and I think they sort of caught that early, I guess. And I think the interest among young people, at least, and this is anecdotally among people I know and among people who read Parapraxis, they're not doctors. Yeah. And I think the sort of, I think of the Freud quote, I think this was in a letter to Oscar Fisker, where he says, I want to save analysis from the doctors and from the priests. I want to create a profession of lay curers of souls. And I think that sort of, that's the goal for a lot of people who I think are thinking about psychoanalysis. I want to be a curer. I want that type of very humanist thing. And I think the English case is an example of to an extent at least, this is a place where that was possible for a long time.
Yes, and culturally also, you're quite right, I think. My sense of British psychoanalysis is, historically, it's very much inflected by Romanticism. I mean, it's very much inflected by a kind of culture, that Winnicott used to joke that Wordsworth read him, But there's this sense that, this is Coleridge on the clerisy, that you want to produce a group of people who can deal with the soul, but they're not priests, and they're not government agents. There's this sort of idealism that's actually a very early 19th century idealism, because when you read the biographies of a lot of these 20th century British psychoanalysts, that's what they were all reading.
John Forrester's final and really wonderful book, Freud in Cambridge, I think really thinks about the sort of early 20th century, late 19th century British case.
He's really good on that.
He's very good.
Just to get back to the question, I think it's noteworthy that, Freud used the term psychic censor in the topographic model, and later, of course, I think you've all heard of the word repression. These are political terms too. I mean, they're applied to political situations. And one thing I think I took out of today's conversation is how I put it together from what I've heard here from all of you, that, in some ways, knowing how to manage censorship, or what do you do about censorship, first of all, on a personal level, which is what Freud was interested in, but could it be applied to at a political level? I think that's really a fascinating connection.
Go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you all. Taking the question as being about America in particular, I want to reflect that there was a time when psychoanalysis was really big in America, immediately after World War II, and in a particular form. It was ego psychology, which was very much about neurosis and sort of suborning the human to society. And the psychoanalysis that exists today internationally is a lot more integrated in terms of its. I was just at the IPA in Lisbon, and a lot of the papers are about what they call pre-symbolic states, unrepresented states, the sort of psychotic parts of the personality, which in the ego-psychological frame were considered deficits, or they were sort of off stage. And I think that created a problem in the American mental health system. So there's something, I think, in the new psychoanalysis, or today's psychoanalysis, that's actually quite new. And I think it may also be meeting the moment, because if you think about what's been going on since 2015 or so, all of us have more access to unrepresented states, more paranoid, primitive aspects of the personality.
I think absolutely right. We've become a lot more user-friendly since then, and perhaps one aspect of our decline that was of our own making historically was in that era of the heyday, we weren't quite as user-friendly. And there was a sense of pathologizing built into, I think, psychoanalytic theory that maybe was in certain ways broadly stigmatizing in the end. But anyway.
Yeah.
It's funny you should talk about neuroses, because my comment is actually pretty similar. I was going to try to bridge the gap between Mr. Dames and Dr. Kafka, because you kind of you're posing this dichotomy between puritanical repression and then hedonistic liberation, and I would posit that our extreme level of interconnectivity through social media creates something totally different, which is the age of FOMO. It's not about how much sex people are having or aren't having, it's how much people think other people are having sex, and they're it's creating new anxieties about sex that probably didn't exist in the time when people spoke less. And then at the same time, it's validating some more violent aspects of sexuality. And what comes to mind there is incel culture. I don't know if anyone's seen that show on Netflix, Adolescence, but all of this stuff is coming to the surface that's really neurotic and paranoia inducing. So I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but.
I mean, in one sense, it seems to me that what you're describing is the Oedipus complex, right? The absolute kind of overpowering fantasy of what other people are doing behind closed doors that you only have glimpses of, fills you with envy, fills you with anxiety, fills you with a wish to punish, fills you with a terror of being punished. That those, I think one of the reasons that those feelings are so powerful is that those are the deepest feelings we have in many ways. And whether you're kind of Kleinian and think they're there from the very beginning, or Freudian who thinks they come a few years later, I still do believe deeply that those are the feelings, the experiences, the fantasies that rule our lives. And I do absolutely think, so that part I don't think is new, but I do absolutely think that it's become sort of dispersed or generalized in ways that we still don't sort of fully understand the consequences of.
We were all very small ones.
We were all very small ones and are terrified of feeling that small again.
Yeah, I just wanted to just some simple observations as somebody who went through training to become a clinical psychologist in the 80s, and was trained here to be a psychoanalyst and am no longer practicing. But the importance of historical context regarding Freud and regarding psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was co-opted in the United States, by a certain establishment, and so psychoanalysis was for the last decades of the 20th century, really was about power, was about a certain kind of power and a certain kind of resistance to that. And psychoanalytic reality in terms of its place in the training of a psychotherapist, eventually increasingly constricted and and suffered its own, if not demise, radical diminishment, and new things and new ways in the context of the now and this last decade especially, where there is this threat to the individual, to freedom of speech and thought that is increasingly concerning, our obligation as psychoanalytically informed humans, in the interface of history, of current reality, political, social reality, with psychoanalysis, what is our obligation? Very simply, in terms of reaffirming such basic ideas as the analytic situation, the idea of interpretation, that individuals can embark on a project of understanding together with another, and really be able to have some tools with which they can look at, a reality that's gone mad, and and in a way that really is squelching and dampening of creative thought and empowered thought. What is our kind of moral obligation in simple ways to reaffirm what the individual can do in his, her own enterprise, psychotherapeutic enterprise, that will be tools that they can use forever in their lives to help reaffirm, a pluralistic, humanistic view of reality.
So maybe you've already covered this. But it seems to me, in speaking with people, there seems to be a conflict between group, family, and individual. The family relationships, how have they changed since Freudian times? What is the relationship to the individual, to family, to group? Has group become more interested in the whole conflict of where the individual stands in relationship to concept of what is family today and what is group relation? It's a big question, but you can just take a small part.
I think that could be several more roundtables.
Alex?
Okay, so this one's from me. I guess it was inspired a bit by a comment asking about, I guess you kind of went over it, looking at how much the hypotheses and theories hold water. So I guess two comments I have. One is, I come from basic science, and I like Freud, but from my experience, anecdotally, most people don't really like him, or if they know him, if they even know him, right? So usually it's a sexist, or has he been disproven? This is from a basic science, neuroscience background. And usually if they do know, they're all about CBT, because a lot of neuroscience is built off of Skinner, who showed a lot of success and results with behaviorism. So I guess the comment is, how do you pitch to a basic science person that you should look at Freud, considering that, like, how do you bring falsifiability into psychoanalysis? Because that's going to be, like, that's the only way you're going to be able to compete with CBT in that realm, at least, right? Independent of the clinical or more literary realms. And the other comment I had is, I notice there's a lot of left-wing coded speech when we're talking about Freud, turning people into curers in terms of like a more left-wing perspective, which is fine, because if I had to choose between that and a right-wing psychosexual theory of consciousness, I prefer the former than the latter for a variety of reasons. But I still think just, I don't know, I feel, shouldn't we aim to make it a bit more universal than to use the language of Marx and other left-wing thinkers who weren't necessarily maybe enmeshed in Freud, or I don't know, I guess I'm trying to, I just think like, I guess the comment I want to get to is, there's a lot of anti-psychoanalysis going, thought, like with Thomas Oz, with anti-psychiatry, and so I'm thinking their whole point about removing institutions was, not only was there abuse, but also there's this idea of like mind control and enforcing certain political viewpoints into patients. So if you're coming about psychoanalysis from a left-wing perspective, how are you going to combat against those people saying, well, you're just trying to, convert these people to your political ideology? So those are my two comments.
Interesting. I had a couple of thoughts. One is about verificationism. I don't know if you can bring verificationism into the center of Freudian thought, but I mean, that could be a flaw, but it could be that, what's really interesting about psychoanalysis, like literature and art, is it's about what gets missed by verificationist thought. It's about what's, exceeds it. And that might be okay, or it might not interest people, but it might not fit that framework. The point about politics is very interesting, and I wonder about it because any mode of thinking that puts the unconscious at the center of it, surely the politics could surprise you. It could go in lots of different directions. And yeah, I'm not sure that you can make an argument for psychoanalysis as being aligned with one in particular. I mean, I think it's very interesting that people do, but surely it's always got more surprises in store.
Is it wrong if for instance, like, I am left-wing, is it wrong for one who is of a certain political bent to use psychoanalysis like as a tool towards one's own political gains, aims?
I think you kind of want to have it a little bit both ways, right? Because if you want to make people curers for people, you should want to cure people independent of whatever their views are. I guess it's more about if you're going into a relationship where you're providing psychoanalysis to a potential patient, you have to be cognizant of your own view. Like, you have to be cognizant of your own views and the way that how you're interpreting the views of the patient, and how the patient interpreting your own views. So I think it's just about like cognizance of that in that relationship, which is where, and because I'm just, again, going back to Zaz, I'm not a Zazian. I disagree with them, but I'm saying their viewpoint would be like, hey, if you're not going to go in with that cognizance, you're not going to be aware of the fact that you potentially are trying to do some sort of mind control, because the thinking is the patient's coming to you as a more knowledgeable other, right? So you have sort of power in this dynamic. And like, if you're not cognizant or aware of that, that could be, it's like the slippery slope of that.
I think these are really valid points, and I guess what I would add is that a lot of our training as clinicians goes to this, right? And that the sort of fundamental principles of neutrality and abstinence in the clinical situation are very, very important. And yes, they're under attack from various places, but I don't know any serious clinician who doesn't believe that it is not our place, or like we're doing double negatives, who affirmatively believes in our responsibility to let our patients develop themselves as themselves and not as some kind of image of us. And so, is somehow the dynamic between patient and analyst, which frees the patient's thought up and frees the patient to think for themselves, I have seen that move patients in all kinds of different directions politically. I mean, just in my own practice. And I think that's probably true for most of us who are committed clinicians. I will also just add, sorry, one more quickly, which is we actually live in an era, a really kind of amazing era of empirical validation. And I completely agree that you can't capture what's most important, but there's been a lot of capturing of what's somewhat important. And what's his name, Jonathan Shedler, has both really exposed the bunk science behind so much of the kind of empirical validation of CBT. And once you get into reading that stuff, it is shocking what they've gotten away with, and the name's empirical validation. And there's been major studies all over the world about the efficacy of psychodynamic psychotherapy that is actually very, very compelling and comforting.
And I just wanted to say, I think the point that I was making was not like, I think clinicians should teach their, or somehow, impart their political values onto patients, but the act of treating certain people or having, whatever, I think there is a sort of praxis to the idea of like, I'm going to, have a certain amount of low-fee patients, or I'm going to work in this particular way. I'm going to have these things in mind while treating certain types of people. I think that is a political act, and I think that is a left-wing political act to me. And I think that's like something that I think there is an increasing interest among left-wing people about psychoanalysis because it restores dignity, because it does actually like care about, you could say it cares about like, oppressed people. Or it can.
Our common humanity.
Yeah.
As a psychoanalyst, I know often says, our time is up today. We'll have to take this up again tomorrow. Anyway, thank you, everyone, for your attention and our wonderful panel here today.